Alright, folks. I've got some forbidden knowledge with me that's probably gonna get me murdered by the anime Illuminati. Because apparently, no weeb on the planet knows how to clearly explain what Jojo's Bizarre Adventure is. But that is exactly what I'm gonna do here right now. I turned off my AC and ceiling fan, I just heard thunder, so let's hope the audio in this video isn't absolutely beamed by the time it's posted. With that, let's just get into this. I have my notepad, I have some meme images which you're probably seeing on screen right now. Look at that, I use Comic Sans because, fuck you. We're past the 30-second mark in this video. Anyway, my intent with this video is for this to be basically an all-in-one guide to understanding what JoJo's Bizarre Adventure is. Like, you just have to watch this one video, you can get basically everything you need to know about what it is, and then you're good to go. If I finish with that, and then I still have some time to fill, I'll just start, I don't know, rambling about stuff that I think is cool in JoJo's. Well, we'll see how that goes when we get to that. But, this video was also, like, heavily inspired by my favorite YouTuber, Grapefruit. If you haven't seen him, he's like the funniest person on the planet, and he's done a series that's far more entertaining than what I'm about to do, where he just kind of goes through every part of the JoJo's series and talks about it. Now that the whole intro's done, I'm already 2 minutes into this audio, at least in the unedited version. Let's look up my notes and start talking about this. JoJo's Bizarre Adventure. It is a manga and anime series that we began back in the 80s and is still being written to this day. Currently, the anime has just finished its Part 5 adaptation 2 years ago or something like that, back in 2019, I think. And the Part 6 animation has just been announced. Can't wait for my girl Jolene to finally get her animation. And currently, the manga is up to Part 8. In the parts called JoJolion. So yes, it is just a manga and anime like any other. It's a shonen style manga and anime. It's about characters fighting. It's divided up into what's called parts, simple enough. Each of these parts is basically its own... It's basically the length of a season in other animes, but it's its own self-contained stories. Part 1 and 2 are a bit unique in that they're different from the rest of the series in the power system that they're using. They use Hamon instead of stands, and we'll get into that later. Before that, though, the entire story of JoJo's Bizarre Adventure is the Joestar family bloodline versus the legacy of Dio Brando, and we'll get into him later. The Joestar family is as follows. Each of these main protagonists gets their own part. Starting off, we got Jonathan, the OG, then we got Joseph, his grandson, then we have Jotaro, Joseph's grandson. Jotaro's probably the one that you know best, if not Giorno later down the line. Then after that, we have Josuke, who is the illegitimate child of Joseph. We'll get into that later. Then Giorno, who is the illegitimate child of Jonathan. Really weird explanation for that one, but we'll get into that later. Then we have Jolene in Part 6, my favorite part, who is the daughter of Jotaro. Then, after that, there's a completely new universe. Like, it's basically a reboot of the series in Part 7. And starting off fresh, we have Johnny Joestar. And then after that, we have, in Part 8, Gappy. Who is technically also named Josuke, but that's a much more complicated main character. I don't think I'll even talk about him too much in this video. So on to these parts. What's this whole thing actually about? Part 1 and 2 is about Hamon users fighting vampires. What is Hamon? Alright? Hamon is life energy, basically. It's an energy that is the equivalent of the energy you find in sunlight. It flows through all living things, except vampires, apparently. And it is obtained by breathing exercises, is the simplest way to put it. Basically, users who learn how to properly breathe can draw on the power of Hamon, and their breathing is what generates this sort of electricity, and it flows through the veins of their body. That's basically the only thing about Hamon that isn't really explained is how they can target which part of their body they want Hamon to come out of, because it it's kind of clearly stated that it starts in the lungs with their breathing. But later on, I think a part 3 stand explains it, and we'll get into that in a minute. In part 1, we have Jonathan. He fights Dio. Jonathan goes on a pretty straightforward Castlevania style quest to go slay the big bad vampire. And that part ends with spoilers, Jonathan getting killed and Dio severing Jonathan's head off his body and putting himself onto Jonathan's body as his new body, because during his fight with Jonathan at the end, he had to cut his own head off to stop Hamon from spreading through his body and killing him. Part 1 was kind of weird. But guess what? Here comes part 2. Part 2 is the coolest part, specifically because of Joseph Joestar. He has like a personality trait where he predicts what people are going to say next. It's a ton of fun. He's just the coolest Joestar by far. Not the most badass, not the most powerful, just the coolest. Anyway, in part 2, we see that there's this other species of vampires, kind of, called pillarmen, and there's only a few of them. And, you know how vampires make ghouls when they bite them? Well, basically, pillarmen can make vampires. They're like the next tier up, apparently. And there's 4 of them in the series, part 2 specifically. And basically, part 2 is just Joseph fighting pillarmen. That's the whole thing. Then part 3 rolls up. Part 3 is the one that's everybody's favorite. It's like the most popular one. It's where these things called stands get introduced. What is a stand? A stand is the physical manifestation of a person's mind, kind of. You might have heard it get called like a ghost Pokemon that you summon with your brain or something, which is kind of true. Personally, I like to think of them as like personified console commands, because that's essentially what they do. The thing that makes stands so special is that they really refine down the whole shonen anime genre. In most shonens, the fights are decided by who gets stronger, and punching harder is the solution to most of the fights. Whereas the more enjoyable fights are when main characters learn something or outsmart an opponent. It's something that we can ground ourselves in and focus in on, something we can follow more easily. Part 3 stands, and stands in general, were kind of perfect because stands don't like get stronger except when they totally do and the rules get broken, kind of. They just have to, the user has to learn to use them in more creative ways. The first stands we see are Star Platinum. It's basically just punching the stand. All the part 3 stands are very straightforward, except for a few of them, which are just nutty nonsense. But stands that are absolute nonsense are kind of my favorites. So in part 3, the reason Dio comes back in part 3 is because at the end of part 1, he killed Jonathan. He got inside this coffin that he had housing his body, which, mind you, also had Jonathan's girlfriend slash wife in like the upper compartment of the coffin. And most people don't realize that there's probably just like a second compartment in the coffin. It was like a super extra looking coffin with like Dio's name put on it and shit. So he was rolling up with the clout coffin. So it probably just had a second compartment that was sitting at the bottom of the ocean for 100 years. And at the start of part 3, some fishermen fish it up from the ocean and opened it, and then Dio was released from his tomb. Then that starts off the events of part 3. So the plot of part 3 is that Jotaro and the gang need to go and kill Dio. That's all. Because the plot of that is that when Dio's body got a stand, technically it's still Jonathan's body as well, and his soul is kind of still in it. So when it received a stand, Jonathan's body sent out a distress signal, so to speak, to his bloodline, and it gave his entire bloodline stands, which comes into play in part 4, as you'll see later. Also, in JoJo's, bloodlines are, like, magically connected. You can just, like, sense people that you're related to. It's never really elaborated on beyond that. So, of course, they end up killing Dio, and they return home. I think that's good enough for, like, a quick explanation of that. That's, like, the thing that everybody talks about, is the Dio versus Jotaro fight, with, like, time stopping and, like, the road roller being dropped on Jotaro in stopped time. It's a really cool fight, but if you were told about JoJo's, and that's the thing you were being told about, and then you tried watching part 1, and it was like, what the fuck is this? This is, like, vampires, and, like, these characters don't really resemble the people I saw in that clip on YouTube. This is what people are actually talking about. Part 3, there's a new main character. Dio comes back from the dead, and this is the new plot. This is the normal now for JoJo's. So whatever, part 3 is behind us. Part 4. Personally, I quite like this. A lot of people don't like it because most people's favorite is part 3. Part 4 is much more of a slice of life story. In part 4, it's revealed that Joseph, who is now quite old in this story, had an illegitimate child during his time in Japan, and that child's name was Josuke. Josuke has a very cool stand. It's like, its ability is to, like, return things to their previous state, although it's really just shown to be like a healing stand. And when it first gets used, it seems like every attack it does automatically gets healed, and when I first saw that in the anime, I was wowed, because I was like, oh, how's this even going to be useful in fighting if it's healing every attack it deals? But it turns out later that that's just an ability it has, and he was just using it each time he threw a punch in the first few scenes. So, part 4, all of it takes place in a town called Morio. There's no big grand adventure, it's just all the events take place in Morio, and what's different is that in this, a lot of the stand users that they fight end up just becoming their friends who hang out with them later on and you see around town, which I quite like. It's a much more casual story, until the whole Yoshikage Kira thing. Yoshikage Kira is a serial killer who lives in Morio, and he has a stand called Killer Queen, which allows him to turn anything he touches into a bomb. I won't go into detail about the aspects of how his stand works, especially because in an arc called Bites the Dust, which is the last arc, I think that's what it's called, but it's the ability that his stand gets at the end. It has so many extra new abilities to it that make it much harder for him to lose. And it's like, you cannot at me and tell me that that isn't a Requiem stand. I'll get into Requiem stands later in part 5 because that's where they're introduced. But, like, Bites the Dust being a Requiem stand, that's the only thing that explains what that is. It just has to be a stand. It just has to be a Requiem stand. Don't even at me. And I might talk about why it's a Requiem stand later, but again, trying to be brief with this whole explanation of what this whole situation is. Hey there, it's editing Makeshift from the future. Completely forgot to talk about stand arrows in part 4, because that's where they get introduced. So the stand arrows are something which are used to force people to generate stands. They apparently arrive on a meteor from space just thousands of years ago in history, like before the Pillarmen are even born, if I'm not mistaken, or sometime shortly after they're born. But The meteor was forged into a set of arrows, two of which are Requiem arrows, which you'll see that later on in the video. The regular arrows, they all contain a virus on them, I think is what the lore says, which when you are shot with the arrow, there's like a 50% chance that you just straight up die instantly from it. And if you don't get killed instantly, you develop a stand because it like forces your body to adapt to it or something. It just pushes you to the brink of death. It's not the only way that stands develop. There's plenty of other like ways in which people get stands. For example, Joseph Joestar in part 3, his stand was just the Hamon stand. Like it's Hermit Purple, which you see it also comes out of Dio's hand early on in part 3, but that's Jonathan's stand. Hermit Purple is just kind of the stand that Hamon users get, it seems, which then raises the question of like what happens when regular stand users learn Hamon. Like, do they get the Hermit Purple stand? It's best not to think about that. Anyway, back to the video. Now into part 5, which is a really cool part that I think a lot of people didn't quite realize was as cool as it was. I bet that's going to be exactly what happens with part 6, because a lot of people said they didn't like it, but it's a really good part. So part 5 is about Giorno Giovanna, and he's probably the one that you keep seeing on YouTube. His like theme is really popular, and he's the one everybody's talking about because he's the most recently animated. He is the child of Dio Brando, but because Dio, his body was Jonathan's body, it's technically genetically Jonathan's child, but the vampire DNA got mixed in, kind of. I don't think Araki fully understands how DNA works, but then again, this is also fiction, you know, magic bloodlines and whatnot, so I can just roll with it. His whole part is very disconnected from the mainline story, and he's not a very nice character. He just kills like any enemy stand users that get in his way. It's basically the story of what if Dio was one of the good guys, like a character that's completely willing to kill people. What if that guy was on the side of good and he had to fight against odds that were against him? And that's really all there is to say about part 5. There's only like a few returning characters that you see in it, and that's basically all there is to it. It occurs after part 4, very briefly after part 4, might I add, like immediately after, unlike the other parts, which are separated by big gaps in time. And it's like Araki's way of venting out his desire to like show like gore and whatnot, because one of the characters can heal really bad wounds. In part 5, it's revealed that there is also an arrow called the Requiem arrow, which if you stab your stand with it, your stand gets transformed in such a way that it gives you exactly the ability that you need at that point in time. And that's basically all there is to it. I'm not going to go into how Requiem stands work here, because again, I want to try to keep this as short as possible, but it's already 20 minutes long, or 19 minutes long. So I'm just going to move into part 6. Part 6 is about Jolene. Now, the whole plot of this is that Jolene gets framed for a car accident that she wasn't the perpetrator of, and she gets sent to prison. And basically the whole thing was a setup to lure Jojo into a specific location for the main villain to attack him. The main villain of this is named Father Pucci, who was a very close friend of Dio's, probably his gay lover, let's be real here. I don't think it's ever explicitly stated, but it's very heavily implied. And what he wants to do is fulfill Dio's dream of achieving heaven. And what is achieving heaven? It's basically like the next tier in power scaling of Jojo's. Like, you had the Requiem stands before, the Over Heaven stand is now like the next level of it. Again, explaining Over Heaven stands would be really difficult. They take like, there's so many details about the final arc of part 6 that just it would just take too long to explain the whole thing. and this video is already too long. So I'm just gonna say over heaven stands, they're they're really weird, and I would recommend watching parts or reading part 6, especially because it's about to get animated and it's hopefully gonna be really good. So parts 7 and 8, I looked at a bit of part 8. I thought the Wonder of You fight was really cool, and I've been keeping up with that, but parts 7 and 8, what you need to understand about those is part 6 had an ending that is kind of it's very final without giving any spoilers. Like it's really a big cutoff point for like every possible story arc in it. But part 8 or part 7 is not a continuation of what occurred in part 6. Part 7 is just a complete reboot of the series, like a refresher. Araki went back to his origins because he started this thing in the 80s. Steel Ball Run was being written in, like, I think 2010 is when it was finished, I want to say. I'm not sure. But he had a lot of writing experience, so he basically went back to the drawing board. And instead of Hamon, we have the spin this time. The spin, I have no fucking idea how that works. Basically, the best I can find is it's like you need the spin is just a property of motion that can be applied to basically any object, and any person can learn this, unlike Hamon where only a select few could learn it. The spin is something that can create an infinite amount of energy. So what's supposed to happen is you take a ball and you spin it, and you're supposed to spin it in such a way that it follows the golden ratio. It's this spiral looking thing, and it's hard to envision how that's even supposed to work. Like, how are you supposed to move your hand if you're not just spinning it like a basketball in your fingertip? Like, are you supposed to also move your arm around in such a way that you kind of arc it in a certain shape? I think that that's it. Like, if you picture spinning a basketball on your fingertips, then like move your arms around in such a way that you follow a spiral, like a seashell shape. That's kind of what it is, I think. And what it's supposed to do is create a kind of reverberating action where it takes a small amount of energy and makes more energy, which breaks the laws of conservation of motion, but it can cause basically an infinite amount of energy to come out of a spin, and that's something that comes up in part 7 quite a bit. Is the two main characters end up using stand abilities, which can they just put an infinite amount of energy into certain things or certain motions. That's all you really need to know about part 7 for now, is just the spin is where that's introduced, and there's still stands. I still need to read that one. And part 8. Part 8 is where stands are just absolutely batshit wacky. Some are like not even useful. There's a street corner that has a stand. It's like not even a person has it. There's some stands that are like take weeks of preparation to even use. I'm thinking of one in particular, but and there's other stands that are absolutely iconic and they're extremely powerful, very cool stands. There really isn't too much else to say about part 8. It's just the reboot of the later parts of the original universe, except that it also introduces rock people or rock insects, which, again, I need to learn more about those. I don't even know if I'm going to keep this part of the video since I just don't know enough about those to talk about them. But anyway, that's, I don't know, my take on what is JoJo's Bizarre Adventure. This is probably way longer than it needed to be. Peace.